For 10 minutes, the ground in southern Chile did not stop moving. Not 10 seconds. Not 1 minute. 10 full minutes. The earth tore along more than 1,000 kilometers of coast. When it finally stopped, the land itself had dropped. In places, it stood 2 meters lower than it had that morning. The old maps of the coastline were suddenly wrong. They had to be thrown away. 2 million people had no home by nightfall. And the shaking was only the beginning. 15 hours later, on a beach in Hawaii, people who had felt nothing at all began to die. A day later, the same thing happened in Japan. No tremor had reached them. No ground had moved under their feet. The thing that killed them had happened an ocean away that same afternoon, on a fault most of them had never heard of. This is the Valdivia earthquake in Chile on the 22nd of May, 1960. It is the most powerful earthquake ever measured by a human instrument. More than 60 years later, nothing has come close. This is not really a story about how hard the ground shook. It is a story about how badly the science of the day underestimated what this coast could do. By the end, 3 things will be clear. It will be clear why the machines built to measure earthquakes could not measure this one, and why it took 17 years to say how big it truly was. It will be clear why one engineer had to hold back an entire lake with bulldozers and shovels. He was trying to save a city that had already fallen. And it will be clear why this coast goes silent for a century at a time, and why that silence is the most dangerous thing about it. Start with the afternoon itself. It did not come without a warning. The trouble was that nobody read the warning correctly. The day before, in the early morning of the 21st of May, the ground moved near the city of Concepcion. It was a strong earthquake, around magnitude 8. In almost any other year, that shock alone would have gone down as one of the worst disasters in Chilean history. Instead, it became a footnote. It was the opening act, and no one knew it was an opening act. More strong shocks followed through that day and night, each one a little further south than the last. The fault was unzipping, stretch by stretch, and moving toward the place where it would truly let go. You can almost watch it happen on a map. The first big shock struck in the morning near Concepcion, in the north of the zone. Over the next day and a half, more shocks came, each one further down the coast than the last. Then, only about a quarter of an hour after the last of them, the ground made its final decision. This was not a single break. It was a boundary that had held for lifetimes, giving way segment after segment, until the whole of it was moving at once. That place was the coast near Valdivia. The time was 11 minutes past 3 in the afternoon. Many people in Valdivia had been shaken all night by the earlier tremors. Some later said they heard a sound before the real shaking started. A deep rolling rumble under the floor, like a heavy train passing somewhere beneath the house. That sound saved lives. It sent people out of their homes and into the open before the worst arrived. It is one reason the toll was not far higher than it was. 10 minutes of shaking is not one long jolt. It is the sound of a rupture traveling. The break began at one point on the fault. Then it raced along the boundary, tearing the 2 plates apart as it went, kilometer after kilometer, for 1,000 kilometers. It moved at thousands of kilometers an hour. But even at that speed, 1,000 kilometers takes minutes to cross. Every place on the coast kept shaking for as long as the tier was still running somewhere near it. The length of the fault and the length of the terror were the same thing, because when the main shock came, the buildings did not fall all at once. They fell slowly, over minutes. This is the strange cruelty of an earthquake this long. A normal quake lasts perhaps 30 seconds, and a building either survives that or it does not. Here, a house might hold through the first minute, and the second and the third. Then, worn down by the endless motion, it would give way in the 6th. Survivors described a shaking that simply would not end. Every time they thought it was over, it came back. Try to sit with what that would feel like. Count it out. Most earthquakes are over before the mind has finished registering fear. This one gave people time to run into the street. Time to watch the buildings they had just left begin to lean. Time to gather in the open and slowly understand that it was still going. Time to see the ground itself crack and roll. The motion passed from something that might end at any second into something that felt as if it might never end. The duration was not just a number in a report. It was a length of pure terror that most people will never know. In the city of Valdivia, close to half of the buildings were left unusable. The ground under the region dropped by more than 2 meters in a matter of minutes. Rivers spilled over their banks into land that had just sunk beneath them. Some 20,000 people in that one city were homeless before dark. Across the whole South, that number climbed into the millions. It is hard to put that loss in proportion. The number of people made homeless in Chile came to around 2 million. In a country of the time, that was close to 1 person in every 4. Tens of thousands of houses were simply gone. The cost of the damage ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars of the day, worth several billion now. Thousands more were injured, and the region's hospitals had been shaken apart along with everything else. Roads, bridges, and ports were broken or drowned in the same afternoon. For days, some communities were simply cut off, left to dig out their own and wait for a nation that was itself reeling. And the fault was not done with them. It had only finished with the land. Now, it turned to the sea. Around 15 minutes after the shaking stopped, the ocean came for the coast. Along the Chilean shore, there was almost no time to run. The water rose in walls that reached 10, 15, in the worst places over 20 meters. The fishing town of Malin was largely swept away. At Corral, near the mouth of the Valdivia River, the sea came in at roughly 8 meters and took the waterfront apart. There is a small human detail from that coast that stays with you. A farmer named José Argomedo was out on his horse near Mollin when the ground began to move. This was the height of the Cold War. His first thought was not an earthquake at all. He thought a nuclear war had begun. He was wrong about the cause and lucky about the place. He was on high ground. Many of his neighbors were not. When the sea finally settled, the coastline was not the same shape it had been that morning. The land had dropped, and the water had come in to stay. Bays had moved. Shorelines had shifted inland. Every navigational chart of the region was now useless. Ships arriving in the months after had to relearn a coast that the earthquake had quietly redrawn. The change was permanent and strange to live with. Farmland that had grown crops for generations now sat under salt water at every high tide. Stands of trees stood drowning where the land had sunk beneath the sea. Whole stretches of pasture became tidal marsh overnight. The people of the coast did not only lose their homes to the shaking and the wave, some of them lost the ground itself, which went under and did not come back. That is what happened where people felt the ground move. The stranger deaths happened where no one felt anything at all. The tsunami did not stop at Chile. It spread outward across the whole Pacific, a set of low, fast waves crossing open water at the speed of a jet aircraft, and it carried its violence for thousands of kilometers without losing it. There is a reason it could travel so far. In deep open water, a tsunami is almost nothing to look at. It is a low swell, perhaps a meter high, spread over a wavelength of many kilometers. A ship riding over it in mid-ocean might never feel it pass. But that low swell carries an immense weight of moving water all the way down to the seafloor. When it reaches shallow water near a coast, that energy has nowhere to go but up. The wave slows and stacks and rears into the wall that comes ashore. The ocean hid the danger for the whole crossing and revealed it only at the very end. The first far shore it reached was Hawaii, about 15 hours later. The town of Hilo, on the largest island, sat in a bay, shaped in the worst possible way. That bay gathered the incoming waves and funneled their energy straight into the town. Hilo had been warned. Sirens had sounded that evening. But Hilo had been warned before, and nothing had come of it. A wave scare in the years just before had brought only a gentle swell, barely worth the drive uphill. The town had learned the wrong lesson. It had learned that the sirens meant inconvenience, not danger. So, when the alarm sounded this time, hundreds of people stayed in the low ground. Some walked down toward the water to watch. A few brought cameras. There was a bitter history behind Hilo's warning. Years earlier, another Pacific tsunami had struck the same town with no warning at all and killed well over 150 people. It was that disaster that pushed the region to build a warning system in the first place. So the sirens that sounded that night existed only because the sea had already taught the town once at a terrible price. But in the years between, two more alarms had brought only small waves. The lesson of the deadly year had been quietly overwritten by the lessons of the harmless ones. The warning worked perfectly. The town simply no longer believed it. The sea pulled back first, the way it does, bearing the harbor floor. Then it returned, not as a single wave, but as a series of them, 8 in all, and the third was the killer. It crested at nearly 11 meters. It erased the district closest to the bay. When it was gone, only the buildings of reinforced concrete and steel were still standing, and even those had been gutted from the inside. 61 people died in Hilo that night, in a town that had felt no earthquake, from a fault thousands of kilometers away. There is one detail from Hilo that has outlived everyone who saw it. In a community hall near the bay, an electric clock hung on the wall. When the wave struck the building, the power died and the clock stopped, its hands frozen at 4 minutes past 1 in the morning. It was never restarted. For decades it hung there exactly as the wave had left it, a small machine that had recorded to the minute the instant a Chilean afternoon reached across an ocean and killed people in their beds. That retreat of the sea is the ocean's oldest and most misread warning. When the water pulls suddenly far out, bearing ground that is normally deep, it is not a curiosity. It is the trough of the wave, and it means the crest is coming behind it. But to people never taught what it means, an ocean rolling back looks like an invitation. Fish flap on the bare mud. Boats settle onto sand, and some walk out toward it into the very place the water is about to take back. Then the wave crossed the rest of the ocean and reached Japan, about a full day after the earthquake. And here, there had been no warning at all. The officials of the time did not believe a wave born off South America could still be dangerous after crossing the entire Pacific. They were wrong. The sea came into the fishing villages of the northeast coast in the dark, with no siren and no alarm. Around 140 people died there. Fishermen, children, people who had gone to sleep with no reason to think the ocean meant them any harm. The same wave went on. It struck the Philippines. It reached New Zealand and the far coast of Australia. It ran up against the Aleutian Islands in the north. One afternoon on one fault in Chile, left dead and damage on the shores of a dozen countries around the rim of a single ocean. Nothing before it had ever shown so plainly that an earthquake is not only a local event. On a coast that faces the open Pacific, a catastrophe on the far side of the world can arrive with the next tide. Put the two far shores side by side. Two islands on opposite edges of the largest ocean on Earth. Neither one had felt the ground so much as tremble. And yet within a single day, both were pulling bodies from the same water, killed by the same afternoon in Chile. If a channel that builds its stories only from verified records is worth your time, following along helps it keep finding them. Now, back to the fault, and to the problem it created for science. Because in 1960, no one could actually say how big this earthquake had been. The instruments failed at the task. A seismograph records ground motion with a pen tracing a line on paper. For this earthquake, the ground moved so far and so hard that the pens simply ran off the edge of the paper. They pinned against the stops and stayed there. The record was not a measurement. It was a machine overwhelmed. Something stranger was happening inside those instruments, and it took a sharp eye to notice it. In Pasadena, in California, a seismologist named Hugo Benioff watched his machines record something no one had a name for. The needles did not spike once and settle. They kept moving, gently, for days on end. What Benioff slowly understood was that the whole planet was ringing, not as a turn of phrase. A struck church bell keeps faintly sounding for a minute or two after the blow. The earth, struck by the rupture in Chile, kept sounding for days. Its lowest, slowest note repeated roughly once every 54 minutes as the entire globe very slightly squeezed and sprang back over and over. Scientists call it the free oscillation of the earth, and Chile in 1960 was the first time anyone clearly heard it. At a station in Strasbourg, in France, the technicians reached a simpler conclusion first. They saw the size of the wave crossing their instruments and assumed the equipment had broken. The reading looked far too large to be real. They checked the cables. They checked the calibration. They found nothing wrong. The machine was working perfectly. The wave passing through the planet really was that big. Observatories around the world tried to put a number on it, and they could not agree. Their figures came out lower than the truth, and they disagreed with one another. The standard way of measuring an earthquake breaks down at this size. The scales in use then rose neatly for small and medium quakes. But above a certain point, they stopped climbing. A monster and a merely enormous quake produced almost the same reading. The rulers had run out of markings. The real size only emerged much later. It took a new idea, and the man who supplied it was the seismologist Hiroyo Kanamori, working in the 1970s. Instead of reading the swing of a pen, he measured the earthquake by the thing itself, by the area of fault that had broken, and by how far the two sides had slipped past each other. That approach did not saturate. It could describe any earthquake, however large. The idea behind it is almost simple. An earthquake is, at heart, a certain area of rock sliding a certain distance. Multiply the size of the break by the distance it moved and by the strength of the rock. Now you have a true measure of the event, one that does not care how a pen behaves on paper. A small quake and a giant one no longer look alike. The giant finally reads as a giant. Run this one through it, and the number came out at 9.5. 17 years after the ground stopped moving, science finally had a figure that matched the scale of the day. To feel what that number means, consider the energy. This single earthquake released more energy than roughly 20,000 bombs of the size dropped in 1945. It is very likely near the ceiling for this planet. To beat it, a fault would have to break along a length that almost no fault on Earth possesses. There is a way to feel the size of it that needs no scale at all. Most people, asked to name the worst earthquake they can think of, will say Japan in 2011. Magnitude 9. A wall of water that swallowed whole towns on live television and wrecked a nuclear plant at Fukushima. That memory is not wrong. It is only incomplete. Chile, in 1960, half a century earlier, released several times more energy than the Japanese quake did. It simply happened with no satellites overhead, no television cameras running, no footage that could travel. The larger disaster took place almost entirely off camera. That is the real gap between the earthquake the world has watched and the one that was, in raw force, considerably bigger. That single number did more than settle an argument about one earthquake. It changed how the whole field thought about the limits of the ground. Before it, no one truly knew how large an earthquake could be. Chile drew the line. It showed the world the upper edge of the possible. Every estimate of the worst case on every subduction coast since has been measured against this one afternoon. There is a deeper irony folded into that. In 1960, the idea that the Earth's surface is broken into great moving plates was not yet accepted science. That understanding would not settle into place for years. So the most powerful earthquake ever recorded arrived before the world had a working theory to explain what caused it. Humanity owned an instrument sensitive enough to feel the whole planet ring. It did not yet own the framework to say why the ground had moved at all. The proof came later, and the machinery that had killed became the machinery that finally forced the theory into focus. So the coast had produced something the science of the time could not even weigh, and it was still not finished. The earthquake had one more sequence to run, and it played out over the following weeks. 2 days after the main shock, 38 hours later, a volcano answered. In the Andes above the ruined towns, a fissure called Cordon Col tore open and began to erupt. The timing was not a coincidence. The enormous stress the earthquake had thrown through the crust had reached the volcano and unlocked it. One catastrophe had triggered another. The ground had barely stopped moving before the sky above it turned to ash. The eruption was not brief. A line of vents opened along the mountain and threw out ash and glassy rock for weeks. And it was only the loudest of the earthquake's marks on the land. Across the southern Andes, the shaking had shrugged whole mountainsides loose. Numerous landslides came down in the steep, forested valleys, most of them far from any town, doing their damage where no one lived. But a few came down in exactly the wrong place. One of them was about to become the most dangerous thing the earthquake had made. But the deadliest of the after events was not the volcano. It was a lake. High in the mountains east of Valdivia sits a lake called Redrew. It is the last in a chain of lakes. It drains through a single river, the San Pedro. That river runs down through the valleys and past the ruined city, on its way to the sea. When the earthquake struck, 3 great landslides came down off the mountainside and fell into the outlet of that lake. They buried the river's exit under a wall of rock and earth. The lake had an inflow and no outflow. So it began to rise. And this was the trap. Every meter the water climbed added tens of millions of cubic meters to the volume held back. And it was held back by nothing but an unstable pile of debris. If the landslide dam failed on its own, all of that water would come down the San Pedro Valley at once. A single wall of water, straight through towns that were already in ruins and into a city that had already fallen. Valdivia had survived the shaking and the sea. Now it faced drowning from behind. The city downstream was home to tens of thousands of people. They were already living in the open, in the wreckage of everything the quake and the sea had left. A flood now would not find a defended town. It would find survivors with nowhere to run. And the water behind the landslides kept rising, day after day, indifferent to all of it. Time was the only thing that mattered, and there was very little of it. What happened next is one of the great, quiet rescues of the century. It was won by hand. A Chilean engineer named Raúl Sáez took charge of the lake. Under him came soldiers and hundreds of workers racing a rising waterline. They brought in heavy machines, 27 bulldozers, to cut a controlled channel through the landslide dam. The mud defeated the machines. They bogged down and could not work the ground near the blockage. So the men switched to shovels. They dug the channels by hand, through weeks of exhausting and dangerous labor. If the dam had gone at the wrong moment, the valley could have become their grave. There was a colder logic behind the digging. Some voices argued for the fast way, for blasting the blockage open and letting the lake run. Sáez refused. Break the barrier all at once, and you release the whole lake in a single killing surge, the exact thing they were there to prevent. The only survivable path was to make the dam fail slowly, on purpose, to open it a controlled amount and let the water bleed off before it could ever tear the barrier down on its own. The rescue worked by choosing a smaller flood in order to escape a far larger one. They won. By late June, they had cut the top of the barrier down, from 24 meters to 15. The lake drained out slowly, over time, through the channels they had carved. It was still destructive downstream, but it came out as a managed release, not as a single killing wall. A city that had already lost almost everything was saved from losing the rest by men with shovels standing in the mud. The work is still taught in Chilean engineering schools, remembered as one of the most successful emergency operations in the country's history. And here is the part the disaster tried to hide in plain sight. None of this was truly new. This coast had done all of it before. The rhythm was not random. Great earthquakes on this stretch of coast have come roughly once or twice in a span of centuries. Long enough always that the people alive for one are never the people alive for the next. Each generation inherits a quiet coast and assumes the quiet is the normal state of things. It is not. The quiet is only the fault holding its breath between one release and the next. The calm that felt permanent was, in truth, the most temporary thing about the place. The record was there for anyone who went looking. The same stretch of fault had broken in the past on a rough, repeating rhythm. It ruptured in the 16th century, again in the 18th, and again in the 19th. Great earthquakes, generations apart, all from the same locked boundary. And the detail that should stop you is this. After the earthquake of the 1500s, a Spanish chronicler wrote down what happened to that same mountain lake. A landslide had blocked it then too, exactly as it would again 4 centuries later. The same trap, at the same lake, set by the same kind of quake. The warning had been written down and filed away for 400 years, and the man who recorded it had no idea what a subduction zone even was. The coast had left its warning in the archive, and no one had thought to read it back. There is a lesson hidden in how the danger was remembered, and how it was not. The written record named the danger, but it lay unread in an archive. The old stories carried the danger, but they were dismissed as legend. The instruments, when they finally came, could measure the danger, but they arrived only after it struck. 3 different ways of knowing, and all 3 failed in the same way. Not because the knowledge was missing, because no one in a position to act had gathered it together in time. The information almost always exists. Attention is the thing that runs short. The people who had lived there longest carried the knowledge in a different form. The Mapuche of southern Chile told of two great serpents locked in an endless struggle beneath the land. One serpent belongs to the earth and raises the mountains. The other belongs to the sea and sends the water over the land. In the story, the ground and the ocean turn violent as a pair. That is not a description of plate tectonics. But for people living on top of a subduction zone, it carries the one truth that matters most. When this land moves, the sea moves with it, and neither can be trusted to stay still. The story had been told on this coast for centuries before any instrument existed to prove the shape of what it described. Even after the Great Tear, the fault kept speaking. Aftershocks rolled through the south for months, some of them powerful earthquakes in their own right, on into the autumn. The boundary that had held for so long did not simply lock again in an instant. It settled and shifted and reminded the survivors again and again that the ground they stood on was not yet finished with them. So, why does this particular coast do this? The answer lies out of sight, offshore and far below. Under the Pacific, just west of Chile, lies a slab of the seafloor called the Nazca Plate. It is sliding eastward and diving down beneath the edge of South America. It moves at about 8 centimeters a year, slower than a fingernail grows. Where the two plates meet, they do not slide smoothly. They catch, they lock together and hold. But the deep motion never stops. So year after year, the locked boundary bends and strains. It stores the pressure of all that blocked movement, like a spring being slowly wound. It can hold for decades. It can hold for centuries. And the longer it holds, the more it stores, and the larger the release when it finally slips. In 1960, it had been storing for a very long time. When it let go along 1,000 kilometers at once. The energy that came out was large enough to leave marks on instruments that have nothing to do with earthquakes. A rupture on this scale shifts enough mass inside the planet to matter. It very slightly changes the way the Earth spins, nudging the length of the day and the tilt of the axis by a tiny, measurable amount. The same effect was later confirmed, with far better instruments, after the giant earthquakes off Sumatra and off Japan. Different coasts, different decades, the same machine underneath, large enough to move the planet a hair on its axis. By the time the lake was tamed and the ash had settled, the south of Chile had passed through something with no real parallel, a record earthquake. Then an ocean crossing the world to kill strangers. Then a volcano. Then a lake that nearly finished what the fault had started. It was not one disaster. It was 4, chained together over weeks, all set in motion by a single afternoon. Most catastrophes are a single event. This one was a season. This is not unique to Chile. It is the signature of every giant earthquake on Earth. Alaska in 1964. Sumatra in 2004. The northeast coast of Japan in 2011. All of them are the same machine. An ocean plate diving under a continent, locking, and eventually breaking free all at once. Chile simply holds the record, because in 1960 its machine broke on the largest scale we have ever measured. What these places share is not bad luck. It is a shape. Wherever a heavy ocean plate is forced down beneath a lighter continent, the same trap is set. The two surfaces lock. The pressure builds for as long as the lock holds. And the size of the eventual earthquake depends on how much of the boundary breaks at once. Chile's boundary is long and straight, and able to break along an enormous length in a single afternoon. That is why, of all the coasts that can do this, it produced the largest one we have ever seen. The dead of that coast did not die for nothing. Almost everything the world now uses to survive these earthquakes was built, in some part, from what happened in Chile. The warning failures taught the first lessons. The wave killed in Hawaii and Japan, hours and an ocean away. It proved that a quake in one country is a threat to coastlines in a dozen others. It forced the growth of a Pacific-wide warning system so that the next far shore would hear the alarm in time. Decades later, after another ocean tsunami killed well over 200,000 people, with no basin-wide warning at all, the world went further. It anchored pressure sensors to the deep sea floor. These machines feel a tsunami pass overhead in open water, and report its true height in real time. No more guessing from a pinned seismograph and a slide rule. Chile learned its own lesson in its own rubble. When engineers looked at what had fallen and what had stood, the pattern was clear. Traditional wooden houses, built to flex, had ridden out the shaking. Concrete poured with no thought for earthquakes had come down. That single observation became the heart of Chile's building codes, some of the strictest on Earth. The proof came half a century later. In 2010, the neighboring stretch of the very same fault broke, at magnitude 8.8. The region was far more crowded than the South had been in 1960. It killed around 500 people. A terrible number, but not the thousands it would have taken without the codes written after the Great Quake. The city itself was rebuilt on that knowledge, where people put up new wooden houses in the old regional way, built to bend and give. Those homes tended to stand. The concrete was the problem, not the wood. Where they poured concrete without engineering it for earthquakes, it often failed again. The lesson was not abstract. It was visible in which walls were left standing, street by street. And it was written into law, so the next generation would not have to relearn it in rubble. Today, Chilean school children practice earthquake drills the way children elsewhere practice for fire. Blue signs line the coastal towns, pointing the way inland and uphill. None of it existed before 1960. Almost all of it exists because 1960 happened. Chile became a place of pilgrimage for the people who study the ground. For years afterward, scientists came from around the world to walk its ruined towns, to measure how far the land had dropped, to map the fault that had done it, to learn from the pattern of what had fallen and what had held. Much of the modern science of great earthquakes was assembled, piece by piece, from this one coast. The instruments now watching subduction zones everywhere are, in a sense, descendants of the scramble to understand a single afternoon. Valdivia now is a green university city of rivers and breweries, known for its beer and its markets. Walk its streets, and nothing whispers what lies beneath them. The plate boundary that broke that afternoon runs directly under the calm of it. The 2010 earthquake carried a quiet message. Faults like this one do not empty all their pressure in one place and then rest for good. They break in segments. One length lets go, and the neighboring length, still locked, waits its turn. The stretch that broke in 1960 has now been silent again for more than 60 years. It is not finished. It is loading. Somewhere on this boundary, a segment is already closer to its own afternoon than anyone would like to know. And this coast is not the only one with that shape. Reach far to the north, to where the western edge of North America meets the sea, and the same machine is at work again, unseen, under cities that rarely think about it. It runs from Northern California up past Oregon and Washington and on toward Canada. The people who live above it number in the millions. Seattle, Portland, Vancouver, and the last time it broke, no European was there to write it down. That coast has its own version of the Chilean story, and its own way of dating a disaster no one recorded. The rupture came on a winter night in the year 1700. It sent a tsunami racing west across the Pacific, and about 10 hours later, that wave arrived in Japan, where villages kept careful written records of the sea. They noted a large wave that came from nowhere, with no earthquake felt before it. A wave, in their accounts, with no parent. It took nearly 3 centuries for scientists to work out where it had come from. The proof was pieced together on both sides of the ocean. On the American coast, a geologist named Brian Atwater dug into the tidal marshes and found buried layers of ocean sand lying on top of drowned soil. It was the unmistakable signature of a coast that had suddenly dropped and been swallowed by the sea, exactly as the Chilean coast had dropped in 1960. Match those buried layers against the date the orphan wave reached Japan, and the picture closed. The Pacific Northwest had produced a giant earthquake on the night of the 26th of January, 1700. 326 years have passed since. On the record of how often this coast breaks, that clock is running down. The lesson of Chile was never really about Chile alone. It is about what a locked plate boundary eventually does, everywhere it exists. Enough decades of silence go by, and the people living above it come to believe the silence is the natural order. The generation that felt the last rupture dies. The generation that will feel the next one does not yet know it is on the list. The ground keeps its own calendar, and it does not share it. That boundary has not stopped. The slab offshore is still sliding east at the same patient rate it moved in 1960 and long before. It does not slow down. It does not rest. It does not care how many years have passed since anyone felt it. It only stores and waits and eventually lets go. People raise their children on that coast. They brew their beer and hold their festivals on a riverbank that sits above the most powerful earthquake the world has ever recorded. There is nothing careless in it. You cannot abandon a coast for what it did once and might do again in 100 years or 3. You can only build for it and watch for it and try not to forget. Forgetting is the one thing this ground punishes without fail. The people who felt the ground move that afternoon are old now and fewer each year. The direct memory of it is fading out of the coast, the way memory always fades. In the end, a shoreline forgets what the sea beneath it is capable of. That forgetting is not a failure of any one person. It is simply what time does to a warning. The question was never whether this coast breaks again. The machine under it makes that a matter of arithmetic, not opinion. The only open questions are which stretch of the fault lets go next, and in what year, and whether anyone happens to be watching the needle on the afternoon it finally moves. Because once